Yumi felt the bottom part of her body pierced with sharp pain. She was pinned down by a torn-off chair and debris. Terrified, the girl watched the other passengers being tossed around the cabin after a powerful blow. The crash that happened to Flight 123 of Japan Airlines became a true hell for the 524 people who were aboard on that day. This air crash is the deadliest by the number of victims in history. In this video, I'll recount the chronology of that fateful flight. I'll also show you the last photo ever taken aboard that plane and reconstruct the recording from the aircraft's black box that saved the last words spoken in the cockpit for posterity. What happened to Yumi? And were there any survivors in that horrific air crash? Watch this video until the end, but here comes the warning. You'll virtually end up inside this disaster. So, as always, viewer discretion is advised. August 12, 1985, Haneda Airport, Tokyo, Japan. It's 6 p.m. A 26-year-old flight attendant with Japan Airlines, Yumi Ochiai, was slowly walking in the narrow aisle in the cabin of the Boeing 747-100SR. It was her day off, and she was traveling to visit her family. Yumi's seat was in the very back, in aisle 56, in the third row from the rear of the plane. The girl was squeezing in between the other people, of whom there were so many that the boarding dragged on for too long, and the flight was late. The thing is, it was the peak of the Obon holiday season, when people traveled all over Japan to see their loved ones or spend time relaxing at resorts. Because of this, there were 509 passengers aboard the plane. Among them, Yumi even saw Kyo Sakamoto, a celebrated Japanese singer who'd written the world-famous hit song, Sukiyaki. Yet not everyone boarding the plane was Japanese. 22 passengers were from other countries: Hong Kong, Italy, the USA, Germany, and Great Britain. Boeing 747-100SR deserved the title of a sturdy and reliable giant plane. Everything in it was built to withstand the load of the popular destination. By that time, the vehicle had already been in operation for over 11 years and had successfully performed approximately 19,000 takeoff and landing cycles. The vehicle looked like a safe and time-tested means of transportation, but its history actually held a detail that would make itself known during that flight. Yet for now, the pilots were busy performing the standard pre-takeoff plane checkup, which didn't reveal any problems. The flight crew was pretty experienced. Captain Masami Takahama had over 12,000 flight hours under his belt. His partner, Yutaka Susaki, was undergoing captain training and had already finished most of his preparatory flights. The crew also had a flight engineer, Hiroshi Fukuda, a veteran of aviation. In short, all three crew members were brilliant professionals, which made the passengers feel assured of their safety during the flight. Meanwhile, there were as many as 15 flight attendants working in the cabin. In this photo, we can see one of them conducting the pre-flight safety demonstration. Yumi wasn't listening. She knew it all off by heart, so the girl just snuggled up in her seat and enjoyed warm thoughts about being welcomed home. At 6:04 p.m., Captain Masami finally got takeoff clearance. At 6:12, the plane soared into the sky over Tokyo, bound for Itami Airport, which served the cities of Kobe, Kyoto, and Osaka. That's where Yumi's family lived. The passengers were relaxing after the takeoff, and one of them took a picture of the window view. This was the last photo ever taken aboard Boeing 747-100SR. 12 minutes after the takeoff, a serious issue arose with the tail part of the airplane. 7 years before the disaster, this same Boeing hit the runway with its tail during a rough landing. This caused severe damage to the fuselage and the rear pressure bulkhead. The plane was sent for repairs, but as it was revealed later, the repair work wasn't up to the mark. Instead of replacing the entire bulkhead, the technicians used two metal pieces held together by only one row of rivets, which didn't meet safety requirements. With time, cracks on the rear bulkhead started widening, and the tail end of the airplane could no longer withstand the regular pressure changes at high altitudes. On that fateful day, this problem, hidden for years, finally revealed itself. At 6:24 p.m., when the plane reached the altitude of over 7,000 meters, a sudden rumble resembling an explosion deafened everyone aboard. In one moment, a 5-meter-long part of the tail, together with the auxiliary power unit, got torn off. Along with it, all the hydraulic lines which controlled the aircraft were severed. Oxygen masks dropped from the panels above the passengers' heads, and panic overtook the cabin. This was the beginning of the end. Yumi, like the other passengers in the rear of the plane, suddenly felt sick. She had a ringing in her ears, labored breathing, and a headache. All of this was brought about by a catastrophic decompression, a drop in pressure, because the wall near the rear toilets was torn so badly that you could see the sky through the cracks. The damaged part of the fuselage started to crackle, and Captain Masami Takahama noticed he was no longer able to maneuver the plane to the sides. The vertical stabilizer was also gone. The Boeing was uncontrollable, and the cabin was decompressed. Oxygen started rapidly escaping outside. Yumi was looking around her, however. The cabin was foggy due to condensation. Napkins, magazines, and all the other things not fixed in their places were floating in the air. The girl heard the voices of people in distress, so she quickly put on her oxygen mask and life jacket and rushed to help others do the same. The pilots in the cockpit were overtaken by panic as well, but the crew was trying to keep it under control. Their profession didn't allow them to give in to emotions at a critical moment. Captain Takahama realized that the lives of over 500,000 people depended on his decisions. He contacted the dispatchers and said, "Hydro, all no good." Then the chaos spread to Tokyo Area Control Center, yet the employees quickly overcame it. They needed to immediately come up with a way of averting the catastrophe. Although both the dispatchers and the airplane crew realized that, given the severity of the damage, the end was virtually inevitable. At that moment, the damaged aircraft was passing Sagami Bay. Masami Takahama asked for permission to return to Haneda Airport, or, alternatively, to perform an emergency landing on Oshima Island. The dispatcher allowed the plane to take a right turn. To do this maneuver, the captain ordered the crew to decrease the tilt, but the control wheel wasn't operational, and the plane was uncontrollable. Instead of turning right, the aircraft unexpectedly developed an almost 40-degree tilt. A significant part of the audio recording of the conversation between the captain and the dispatcher consists of maneuvering instructions, such as nose up, nose down, and power. However, due to the loss of the tail part, all attempts to take control of the wheel were futile. In the meantime, the flight engineer informed everyone that the hydraulic pressure continued falling. 6:27 p.m. The plane was chaotically changing its direction, and each maneuver seemed doomed to failure. That was when the captain understood. From that moment, the plane was ultimately uncontrollable. From then on, all the crew's answers to the dispatcher's questions were confused and fragmentary. The pilots seemed to be losing control not just over the aircraft, but also over themselves. It's speculated that they most likely failed to put on their oxygen masks, although the flight engineer told them to. Since the explosion, they'd been focused only on the difficulties in steering the aircraft. Apart from that, Captain Takahama discovered that the passengers' oxygen masks stopped working due to decompression, so they were essentially useless. 6:34 p.m. The pilots stubbornly continued their attempts to regain control of the aircraft. Their efforts were partly successful. The plane stayed at a set altitude for a bit, but only to start ascending and descending again like a giant pendulum. 6:40 p.m. In a desperate attempt to stabilize the situation, Captain Takahama ordered the landing gear to be lowered, hoping this would stop the dramatic oscillation. However, this had only limited success. The plane started flying in a loop and dropped to a critical altitude while flying over Otsuki. Meanwhile, Yumi and one of the flight attendants were calming down the passengers in the rear right part of the plane. They instructed people on how to prepare for an emergency landing. Some passengers were crying and writing messages on paper to their loved ones. Yumi turned her head to the window, where she saw Mount Fuji on the left. The girl thought they were returning to Haneda, and soon, all of this nightmare would be over. However, the aircraft started spinning again, and it became clear it was probably falling. Suddenly, it became hard for the girl to breathe. The oxygen in her mask had also run out. One by one, the people around Yumi were going unconscious, yet she was still holding on. Was the end already near? Nose up, power.
Gas test fail. Minimums. Approaching decision height.
It's the end. These were the captain's last words, captured by the flight data recorder. The aircraft, still tilted, hit the top of a range located near Mount Mikuni at an altitude of 1,530 meters. The plane hit the trees and another mountain, and in 3 seconds, a piece of the right wing and 3 engines fell off. At that moment, Yumi and the rest of the passengers felt a few powerful blows in the cabin. Seats and cushions started flying near the girl. She was trying to stay clear of a cloud of dust and debris. when suddenly something hit her, and Yumi felt a piercing pain in her abdomen. A detached airplane seat pinned her, and the girl found herself in a trap. The aircraft turned on its back, hit another range near Mount Takamagahara, and exploded. The impact was so powerful that at 6:56 p.m., it was even picked up by a seismometer located at Shin-Etsu Earthquake Observatory of the University of Tokyo. That's over 30 kilometers away from the crash site. The plane crashed at an altitude of 1,565 meters. This was definitely the end. But was it for everyone? 12-year-old Keiko Kuwakami barely opened her eyes and saw the remains of the aircraft from above. They were already smoldering here and there. When the airplane crashed, the girl got flung out of her seat and was now stuck in a tree. Below her, she saw her father and sister, who, like her, couldn't move. They were barely replying to the girl, and at some point, their voices became increasingly fragmented and faint. Then they went completely silent. 35-year-old Hiroko Yoshizaki was experiencing unbearable pain. Her eyelids were heavy, and her consciousness was going dim. Suddenly, she was brought back by the scream of her daughter, Mikiko. The girl was shouting, "Don't sleep, Mom, don't sleep, or you'll die. I want to eat, Mom." The woman was joined aboard by her big family. She touched her husband, Yu, who was lying motionless by her side. He was already dead. Then Hiroko stretched her hand toward her 7-year-old daughter, Yukuri, and found she had also grown cold. The woman looked around, trying to find her son, but failed. The night started falling, and Mikiko continued talking to her mom, fearing she might close her eyes forever. Yumi was lying in the darkness, listening to other people breathing heavily, crying, screaming from pain, and calling their loved ones. Suddenly, she heard the sound of helicopter blades, and it was somewhere very close. Yumi still couldn't move, so she started just waving her hands while lying, hoping she'd be seen. But the helicopter kept on flying. The noise from its blades grew faint, as did the people's voices. Now, Yumi was lying in the dark in almost complete silence. This must definitely be the end, right? When the news of the plane crash spread, the U.S. military was quick to react. The crew of the C-130 U.S. Air Force airplane, housed at Yokota Air Base, found the crash site 20 minutes after the disaster. There was still daylight at the time, and the crew managed to share the Boeing's exact coordinates with their Japanese colleagues. An Iroquois helicopter immediately set out for the crash site, but the rescue operation was abruptly cut short by the Japanese government. U.S. soldiers remained on high alert, but were never called to join the mission. Later, after nightfall, the plane wreck was found by a Japan Air Self-Defense Force helicopter. However, due to bad weather and poor access to the area, the pilot couldn't land near the crash site. He reported having seen no signs of life in the debris from the air. Based on this report, the Japanese leadership, which was postponing the start of the rescue operation, decided it was pointless sending on-the-ground rescue squads to the mountain, as there were no survivors in the crash. Instead, the rescuers stayed at a distance of over 60 kilometers from the disaster site and set up an improvised village where they installed tents, built runways for helicopters, and did other preparatory work. They didn't set out for the crash site until the next morning. After examining the bodies, the paramedics were horrified to realize that a lot of the victims had survived the crash, but died at night due to injuries, shock, and hypothermia. Captain Takahama and the crew had most likely died on the spot, since the cockpit was much closer to the nose of the plane and took most of the impact. One of the doctors assessed the situation and said that if the rescuers had arrived even 10 hours earlier, they could have saved the victims. The team was walking among the corpses, hoping to see at least someone exhibit signs of life. They reached the wreck of the tail part and saw someone use the remains of their energy to move their arm. The rescuers immediately cleared everything that stopped them from getting to the victim and started carefully picking up the girl who had broken her pelvis and her arm. "You're all right now," Yumi heard. She'd been saved. It all happened 16 hours after the crash. The other people who were rescued were the young Keiko Kuwakami, Hiroko Yoshizaki, and her daughter, Mikiko. All of them were seated in the 7 rows at the very back. And that's it. That's it. There were no other survivors. Only 4 people out of 524 who had boarded the plane remained alive. This situation precipitated serious criticism of the rescue services. Many people said that faster assistance could have saved the lives of many crash victims. This story is a horrible example of how poor work can result in deadly consequences, although not immediately. So at least some responsibility for the catastrophe was taken by the Japan Airlines company, since they hadn't inspected the aircraft after its repairs. The company's president, Yasumoto Takagi, resigned only 3 days after the disaster, having taken responsibility for the tragedy. Chairman of the technical service that performed the repairs, Hiro Tominaga, took his own life. Although Yumi had survived the air crash, this tragedy left her with emotional as well as physical wounds. Her life would have gone completely differently had she, for example, been late for her flight, like the Japanese comedian Sunma Akashiya and a few other passengers who didn't make it to the airport on time, leaving their seats empty. Tell us in the comments if you've ever experienced a situation where you narrowly avoided disaster. Maybe you were accidentally delayed or changed your plans, and it ended up saving your life. Subscribe to my channel. There are many other videos about real disasters, and I hope they'll help you avoid tragedy by knowing exactly where dangers may lie.